Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Sylvia Forney, ROM Senior Curator of Global Africa, and I'm delighted you could join us for today's ROM Connects program, produced in partnership with the Jackson Park Project. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the ROM sits on what has been the ancestral land of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, since time immemorial to today.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today. My name is Tanya Sutherland, and I'm the Archival System Development and Research for the Jackson Park Project, which is an initiative to memorialize and celebrate the history of the Emancipation Day celebrations that took place in Windsor, Ontario from the 1930s to the 1960s. We are developing educational resources and a digital archive, which we hope will lay a foundation for a dramatic series that challenges us to reflect on freedom, identity, and civil rights in Canada. The aim of the Jackson Park Project is to take Canadians on a journey to explore and courageously reimagine a new vision of our collective identity. For far too long, Canadian history has been interpreted from the perspective of what was termed the Founding Fathers, British and French. The story of Jackson Park challenges us to see that Black history is also Canadian history. Emancipation Day is not just a Canadian celebration. It is also an international celebration and a movement which challenges racism across former British colonies. In today's event, Dr. Cheryl Thompson, who is an assistant professor at Ryerson University, will explore these global roots and their connection to Carabana, currently known as the Caribbean Festival. Rosemary Sadlier, who is a former president of the Ontario Black History Society and was the first recipient of an award which was recently renamed the Rosemary Sadlier Freedom Award in her honor, is a leading supporter of the Petition and Bill before Parliament. She will address why it is most significant at this time in history that Canada acknowledges Emancipation Day as a national day of recognition. We are incredibly delighted and grateful to have this opportunity to share an exciting side of our Canadian history here today at the ROM. We want to extend our welcome to you as we travel forward on this journey. First, we will begin with the presentation from Dr. Cheryl Thompson.
So today my talk is really going to deal with thinking about Carnival as it relates to emancipation and Carabana. And what I want to start with first is sort of some of the headlines over the years that have marred how we think about Carabana. And as you can see by some of these headlines, some of them go back to the 1970s, some of them are 2001, I think, and some of them are 2008, 2011, all over the place. So there's that narrative. Then there's the narrative of the skimpy outfits or the scantily clad women who people think are lewd or disrespectful. And so that's the one side of the narrative that I think has been replayed through the media since the beginning of Carnival celebrations in Toronto. But what I want to do is take us back to the spirit of Carnival. And that's symbolized here in this Lord Kitchener, Trinidad's Lord Kitchener's 1979 album, and get us to think about, why do we have a carnival to begin with? I think most people know that it's quote unquote a party on the street, but they don't really know what is at the roots of Carnival. And sort of bookend to that, ironically, Now Magazine had their Carnival issue over the weekend of August 1st, Emancipation Day, where they said this, quote, "White people are more afraid of Carnival than coronavirus. They're eager to escape to the cottage to get away from the city during Carnival weekend. We hear how they're avoiding the parade because people get shot, apparently." And I think that quote sort of captures how the narrative of Carnival celebrations has been so spun by media reportings about a few incidents over the last 52 years, and not what the Carnival is itself and sort of its place in Canadian history. So to begin to understand sort of the roots of Carnival in Canada, you really have to go back to this moment in the 1960s. So this was a pivotal moment in terms of the Caribbean community and changes in government policy. So it really began in 1962, where Canada formally revoked preferential treatment to white and European immigrants coming to Canada. And for the first time, there was an emphasis placed on education and professional skills, not on race and ethnicity. And this was sort of more formalized with the point system that then came into place in 1967. But most people don't really talk about, and here's the point system. Most people don't really talk about the domestic scheme, which was initiated in 1955. And this sort of allowed 100 Black women, mostly from Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad, to come to Canada during this period and work essentially in the domestic scheme for 1 year, and then you can exercise the option to leave. And it's really in this time period where you have a lot of single women from the Caribbean islands that I just mentioned coming to Canada. And when they came to Canada during this time, they also endured a lot of loneliness and homesickness and a lack of their cultural outlets. And sort of this sort of microcosm that was happening across Canada in the major cities of really Toronto, Montreal, to some extent in the nation's capital, and then in Vancouver. And then at the same time, what people don't talk about is that there were also, before this migration, African Canadians from other parts of Ontario and Nova Scotia and elsewhere who had moved to Toronto in the 30s through the 1950s, who were also looking to build community. And the reason that I start with all of this is because this is the cultural context that gave rise to also people's desire to consume these products. So at the same time, in the 40s and the 50s, you had cultural exports of calypso music that were circulating North America and throughout, I would say, Britain primarily. And so this album from Harry Belafonte, Calypso, with the famous song Deo that came out in 1956. And Deo, for those who don't know, is really a Jamaican folk song that's about men who used to work on the banana boats. And so they would sing this song, and then it got popularized. And Harry Belafonte actually wasn't the first person to sing the song. He was one of many who did a cover of this song. This was the only one that became really popular. And then there's Lord Invader. Most people might not know who Lord Invader is, but they might have heard of a song called Rum and Coca-Cola. That was performed by the Andrews sisters during World War II. But in fact, that was his song. So in 1948, he sued them for copyright infringement, and he won. And so this is the context that then gave rise to the idea that there should be a carnival of this form in a city like Toronto. And so here's what happened. In 1951, you had the Canadian Negro Women's Association that was comprised of a small group of Black women, the same group of Black women that I just spoke about, who were some Caribbean and some African Canadian, who came together, and they felt like there needed to be a voice, a more national presence of Black people in Canada. And so they started to organize events. And here's Kay Livingston, who was the first president of this organization, who then went on to help organize the National Congress of Black Women, and this event that was held in 1973, which led to the Congress of Black Women of Canada in 1980, which is still in existence today as an advocacy group for Black women in Canada. And so all of this is sort of the beginnings of the roots that you really needed to take place for the idea of a carnival to be formed in the first place. And so it was actually this group, the Canadian Negro Women's Association, who first had the idea of a Calypso carnival in the city of Toronto. And so their initial idea was that they wanted to set up something where they can create a scholarship for Black students. And this is what they did. So they started this Scholarship for Black Students program in 1951. And it was really probably the first of its kind in the province, because at that time, there was no government funding for this kind of thing. And this event started with, maybe they would hold some teas, then they would have a fashion show. And then ultimately in 1956, they said we should do a Calypso carnival. And I don't think it was a coincidence. It was 1956, especially given Harry Belafonte Deo was also released in 1956. And so this was the beginning of carnival celebrations in Toronto. And the idea was to make this carnival a fundraiser for Black community. And so here you have a quote from Ailina Williams, who was also president of this organization from 53 to 54, and then 73 to 74. And in this article, she is quoted as saying, "We set up scholarships. We had different activities that involved young people. We had the Calypso Carnival that went for 10 years, and that money was used to go into our scholarship fund so that we could maintain it. We were involved in quite a few activities. We built a chalet in Ghana. Our members went to and joined in the Martin Luther King March. So you could see this was a very socially, culturally, and politically active group that most people have never really heard of. And I think that is a real shame. But this is the precursor, right? This is sort of the events that I would say were the primer for there to be a Carabana in Toronto. And so Carabana is really tied in with Expo 67 and Canada's centennial year. So it was really in celebration of the centennial that a group of Caribbean people in the city of Toronto said that this would be a gift that we would essentially give to the country in recognition of the centennial year. And at the same time, Expo 67 really ushered in a new era in terms of Canadian history, because it was really the first time that the quote unquote two solitudes of the country, English and French, had come together. But then also the country was sort of presenting itself as this multicultural space that was welcoming to immigrants from around the world. And so the original Carabana was formed again with thinking about that same group that I mentioned earlier, people who came primarily from Barbados, Trinidad, and Jamaica. And so the first Carabana was held August 5th, 1967. And the Carnival Parade left Varsity Stadium on Bloor Street for a mile-long procession. The weekend event began with this, but then there were also events on the Center Island. There was a Sunday market, there was a cricket match, a fashion show, and then there were numerous boat cruises. And it's interesting because in this Toronto Star article, there's a quote where the reporter says, quote, "The watching Torontonians didn't cheer, didn't wave. West Indians said carnival time in their sunny island homes was never so quiet." So you can see by that quote, people really didn't know how to respond to the event. But that said, even though at the time the Caribbean population in the city was around 10,000, there were 50,000 people who attended the first Carabana, which shocked everyone. And this is the reason why then there was this conversation that we needed to make this an annual event because it was so successful. And at that time, most of the events, yes, there was the parade, but most of the events were held on the island, on the Center Island. And so now, you know, this thing that was created in celebration of our centennial brings in 1.2 million people a year. It's estimated that it contributes 400 million to the economy. And yet most people don't really know what the carnival is about. They think it's just a party on the street with a bunch of Black people. And what I love about this quote from the West Indian News Observer from 1968 is that it gets us thinking beyond just the party on the street. And so I'm just going to read this description of 1968 Carabana. The day is Saturday, August 3rd. The place is Varsity Stadium. The occasion is the second carnival to hit Metro with all its colorful brilliance. Under the sweltering heat of a beautiful summer's day, the masqueraders waited shuffling feet for the parade to begin. The trucks started to roll, and with them went the throbbing sounds of the ubiquitous steel band pounding out the latest in calypso. The carnival parade started, and a shouting, prancing chorus yelled, "Good morning, Mr. Walker," trying to drown the other and more familiar sounds of the city. The 7 bands took part in the carnival festivities this year, stunning onlookers with a diversity of colors and imagination. Headpieces loomed in the air, bouncing and bobbing under a bright blue sky and reflecting the sun in refracted beauty. And because carnival this year was canceled because of COVID-19, I feel like this reading really captures what it is like to actually go to a carnival celebration. It captures all the elements, but what it also does is that it gets in this conversation, in this quote, is really conversations about Emancipation Day. You wouldn't know it by just reading it, but it's all in there. And so what I want to do is talk about the fact that the originators of Toronto's carnival came from especially Barbados and Trinidad. And those ceremonies that were celebrated in Barbados and Trinidad are directly connected to emancipation. So in Barbados, you have crop over. So crop over was a festival that began in the 17th century. On the last day, the sugar canes were cut on a sugar plantation. And crop over was essentially the merging of 2 cultures, English and West African. And it was a unique festival that was only celebrated on the island of Barbados. The origins of the festival were that it first was started on individual plantations, and then sometimes it would be groups of plantations where activities were concentrated in the mill yard. And this image that I have here kind of captures a little bit of that. And it was in the mill yard because that's where the harvesting of the sugarcane was taking place. And so the last day of the season's crop was the sugar was brought into the mill yard, and then people would decorate themselves with bright flowers, would decorate the cart, sorry, with the sugar with bright flowers. And then it was usually a white woman in a dress and a head wrap who would sort of help to tuck all the flowers into the cart. And then she would be accompanied by other kinds of workers who were also loading sugar cane into the carts. And so one of the most famous Bayesian scholars who's now in the UK, Sir Hilary Beckles, he observes that there were generally two types of crop over dances: those organized by and held within slave owners' households, and those convened by the enslaved, with or without their owner's permission. And so this, without the owner's permission kind of celebrations would involve music and dancing, but then there would be improvisation and like witty songs that were accompanied by instruments like banjos, triangles, fiddles, guitars that were being used to create all these rhythmic beats. So even in that description from Hilary Beckles, you see that it was this merger of the sort of the European colonizer and the enslaved African in the Caribbean who created this kind of celebration. And then in Trinidad, it happens in the 18th century. And this can be traced back to when French planters staged masquerade balls at Christmas time. However, with Emancipation, Trinidad Carnival became more about a protest, a rebellion, than just a celebration. So initially in the 18th century, when French settlers brought the tradition of what was then termed a pre-Lenten festival to the island of Trinidad, they found it amusing to dress up and dance like their enslaved Africans. But what they didn't anticipate is that the enslaved Africans would also find it amusing to dress up like them. And at the same time, in dressing up like them, they took the occasion of Carnival to kind of rebel and to use it as a moment of maybe even some rioting against their own subjugation. And so then what you have then is that emancipation actually takes place in Trinidad in 1838. And even across the Caribbean, it isn't directly tied to 1834, 33, 34, as it is in the Canadian narrative. There, it's happening at various stages after 1834. But it's after 1838 in Trinidad that carnival celebrations become bigger and louder and more colorful, and then at the same time, they're also accompanied by riots and protests in the decades that follow emancipation. So much so that in 1881, the British government tried to ban the performers using sticks and drums across the Caribbean. And so this was an attempt by the colonial administration following emancipation to outlaw what they considered to be acts of protest against the state. So in other words, the carnival at that time was being viewed as a subversive act against the state. And so they responded. They also tried to ban drumming. They tried to ban forms of masquerading, i.e. dressing up in elaborate costume, and just singing in public in general. And in typical Caribbean fashion, we kept doing it anyway. And so this is sort of the roots that is still embedded in the spirit of why people celebrate Carnival to begin with. And also steel pan music. Steel pan is really central to this. It did not stop the African people from celebrating as they saw fit to celebrate. And so since drumming was outlawed, what they decided to do was find other ways to keep the music going. And that's really the roots of how steel pan evolved over this time. And so people started using different types of bamboo sticks to make the sort of drumming sounds. And then when the British government tried to outlaw that as well, they began using small biscuit tins. And some musicians eventually noticed that the constant hammering on the tins produced variations in the sound, and they decided to experiment with larger oil drums. And hence over time, as you can see in this image that I actually took at Carabana, I think this is 2018, the steel pan was really born out of this moment of resistance to British colonial rule in the post-emancipated island of Trinidad, and then it spread across the Caribbean. And so it's really, however, between the 1930s and 50s, that same period, again, of Lord Invader and Harry Belafonte in Jamaica, where you have the steel pan music emerging as a kind of popular music in the Caribbean. That's the reason, you know, there was just the other day, I saw a commercial that was for a travel site, and somebody was playing the steel pan as if it was a neutral instrument on the beach, but the steel pan is actually born directly out of emancipation. And so you can see here, as we move ahead, we look at Carnival 1970, the steel pan is already forming a very central part of how the news media is even reporting on Carabana. And at the same time, limbo dancing, which also comes out of the Caribbean, primarily Jamaica. And so here you have this like cultural cacophony of histories and people and culture coming together in what we now call the Toronto Caribbean Carnival. And so today, Carnival celebrations are still happening, not just in Canada, but around the world. You have in Brixton, South London, there's a carnival that takes place in July. The West Indian American Day Carnival in Brooklyn, New York is held over Labor Day weekend, and Miami's carnival is in October. The other Caribbean countries that I mentioned, in Barbados, Crop Over is still held annually in August, and Trinidad Carnival is held in February. And so I think, just to cap off my talk, what I want to end is again with Sir Hilary Beckles, who's now the chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, that's for the Caribbean to seek reparations from England and other places. He writes, "We celebrate Emancipation Day as a moment in which we demand reparatory justice. The advancement of economic growth is dependent upon it, social justice is dependent upon it, and a 21st century humanity is dependent upon it." And I really like this quote because, you know, Toronto's Caribbean Carnival is the only one of these events outside of the Caribbean that takes place the weekend of Emancipation Day. It's the only one that I think in the founders of Carabana had a visioning that we would link these two things together. And I don't think it was by accident. So while we didn't celebrate this year by going on the road, as they say, I think this quote from Hilary Beckles really sums up the spirit of Emancipation Day. And it's also a reminder that carnival celebrations are always about emancipation, but it's not just an emancipation in the past. It's an ongoing demand for social justice and liberation.
Thank you, Cheryl, for this wonderful presentation. Next, we will hear from Rosemary Sadlier.
Thank you so much. That was such an excellent presentation. My presentation will be much briefer, but will still connect very much to the topic. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today on Emancipation Day. I am delighted to do so as part of the Jackson Park initiative with the Royal Ontario Museum. For me, even though I had never had a chance to attend an Emancipation Day event until I began to organize them by 1996 as part of my initiative to seek official commemoration for August 1st as Emancipation Day at all levels of government. It was about the celebrations in Windsor that I heard the most. I am connected to the British Methodist Episcopal Church of Canada. And I would travel to Windsor when annual conferences would be held there, or wherever they might be held in Ontario. But in Windsor, there was always an amazing feeling among local Windsor people. Their way with huge barbecues and the lure of Detroit. Windsor was indeed a place that had been touched by joy, by hosting large groups of people, by feeling at one with the collective. They had a strong identity. The BME Church was one portal through which I was introduced to Windsor, but it was the people who had something incredibly special as I think about it now. I believe it was the comfort, the confidence, and the ease of knowing who they were and how they fit into the global scheme of things in a way that was different for other Black communities in other parts of Ontario that I had had the opportunity to experience. And I believe that that difference was in part related to the communal support and involvement in a unifying process and series of events related to their earlier celebrations of Emancipation Day. In Windsor, at a time before cell phones and before social media, they had contact with Black royalty. From Stevie Wonder and Diana Ross to Mary McLeod Bethune and Martin Luther King Jr. It would only come to end because of changes at Jackson Park and security concerns related to the Detroit riots in 1967. To add to what was already offered, let me say that while Carabana, the celebration that was created in 1967 by a committee of Africans from the continent, Black Canadians and Caribbean Canadians, to celebrate Canada's centennial and Simcoe Day, Emancipation Day. And that I have attended a few of these now, annual events. The connection between Emancipation Day and the Carabana Parade was not made for me. There was no context provided in general at the time. I did not have a personal experience of Carnival to draw upon, so the vibrant costumes, the dancing, the music, they were enjoyable, but they were not raising my awareness about why they were taking place beyond the 1967 reason for that to happen, and why they had connected to Emancipation Day. There were no educational pieces provided, no public debates, no statements issued, just the joy of the movement and the being with other people of African descent. Again, I had never been to an Emancipation Day event, even though there were many in the Toronto region who had in the past gone to events all over the province, but in particular at Port Dalhousie near St. Catharines. While the Windsor event was connected to Walter Perry, the Port Dalhousie event was connected to B.J. Spencer Pitt. A lawyer and committed supporter of the UNIA, he effectively organized and held annual celebrations with Toronto people, taking the steamer to Port Dalhousie and others arriving from Buffalo and Rochester and other parts over water or taking bus routes. Some of these events were connected to services at the Salem Chapel British Methodist Episcopal Church as well in St. Catharines. But by the 1950s, this event had come to an end despite the efforts later made by Donald Moore after Pitt to keep the event going. Of course, the magic of the steamers and their loss due to a fire worked to end the event as well. So how did I get involved in working towards the commemoration of August 1st as Emancipation Day, some 40 years after the event had ended in the Toronto area, and almost 30 years after it ended in Windsor, the two most significant celebrations in contemporary times outside of the joy and spectacle of Carabana. One late evening in the fall of 1995, I received a call at home seeking a meeting to discuss Emancipation Day. I ultimately met with a very tall man from San Fernando, who was the president of the Caribbean Historical Society of Trinidad and Tobago. He had been referred to me by an acquaintance, an African-Canadian historian, so I felt it was appropriate to do so. Thus began my personal journey to conceive of a means of bringing greater recognition to this meaningful commemoration and to make it happen. So in cooperation with the Caribbean Historical Society of Trinidad and Tobago, I initiated a successful request to the City of Toronto in 1995, then Metro Toronto, and then the City of Ottawa to commemorate August 1st as Emancipation Day. The idea was to revive the once annual celebration that existed throughout the British Empire in response to the passing of the 1833 British Imperial Act, the legislation that abolished chattel slavery. In Canada and several other British-controlled countries around the world, it was August 1st, 1834, the date of the enactment of the bill. But in some countries, as has been outlined, it was a gradual emancipation that was not enjoyed until 1838. I petitioned the province for a proclamation, and finally, when again prodded by a friend of mine about what was happening with my request for a provincial Emancipation Day, Ted Arnott, Maria Van Bommel, and Peter Cormos crafted the first all-party unanimous bill in Ontario. It was in commemoration of August 1st as Emancipation Day. I then took this initiative to federal parties, all of them, for their support. Preston Manning was pleased to support it. MP Deepak Obdry got it to second reading twice in the House of Commons, but it didn't make it to third reading. By 2016, on my own, I approached several MPs and senators by mail, actually all of them, by email and in person to support this push for a national declaration. Later, as chair of the Royal Commonwealth Society, I again approached many MPs, having personal meetings with them, and senators. It was ultimately Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard who championed this through to second reading in the Senate. Again, it was lost to the end of the session. So with the beginning of this newest section, it came back with MP Majid Jahari, who introduced it in the House in March of 2020. But the coronavirus interrupted the flow of this initiative that I believe will restart in the fall of this year. It has been since 1995, and it still has not happened nationally. It speaks to how long a meaningful commemoration can take to come into effect. The significance of August 1st as Emancipation Day is that it was the first global human rights act, facilitating freedom for Africans from chattel slavery, and for others the hope that emancipation would soon be theirs. Following this British move to end slavery outright, other global powers followed suit, leading to the current situation in which slavery from birth to death for successive generations was abolished. This is not to overlook the significance of those with abolitionist leanings. The first Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, John Graves Simcoe, was a contemporary of William Wilberforce, among others. When he learned about the forcible removal of Chloe Cooley, an enslaved African woman in the Niagara-on-the-Lake area, and her fight to remain in Canada to resist her captors, to avoid sail on the American side of the lake, Simcoe realized that other slave-owning members of his government and of the community could well try to sell their slaves too, rather than lose their property. He drafted legislation to end slavery, but it was reduced to ending the importation of slaves, the gradual freedom of enslaved children, and freedom for European indentures. It was a step towards the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, but it did not end it. In fact, one could say that the abolition of chattel slavery really came about due to the agency, the efforts, the initiatives of enslaved and free Africans to rid themselves of a horrendous experience and a life marked by a lack of ownership of themselves and excruciatingly long and difficult working situations, all sustained and perpetuated by violence or victimization. It was their strength and courage to resist their circumstances from capture through to full plantation revolts that is remarkable and merits our commemoration. We honor our ancestors for all the brave steps they took. However, perhaps it was the larger acts that garnered the greatest change. Abolition followed the most successful revolution against slavery in the West and the creation of the first African-controlled nation, Haiti, following the successful revolution led by Toussaint Louverture. Abolitionists of African, European, and indigenous backgrounds found their efforts making more headway after that took place. In Britain, the efforts of William Wilberforce culminated in the abolition of the British-controlled transatlantic slave trade. It was his view that the voyage, as if it was a trip on a luxury liner, but anyway, the voyage, the capture in Africa, and the transport across the Atlantic in tightly packed slave ships was the most heinous aspect of enslavement, and ending it would end much suffering. While he may not have imagined what restrictions and what intensified actions had developed to increase and maintain the enslaved population, it did not ameliorate the situation of still enslaved Africans. The 1807 abolition of the transatlantic slave trade did not free a single enslaved African, but it did add to the movement to bring about its demise. Further slave uprisings in the West took place, including those led by Gabriel Prosser in Richmond, Virginia, about 1820, and that of Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822. Then the Sam Sharp Rebellion in 1831, Jamaica, as well as Nat Turner in Virginia in 1831. The resistance of enslaved African people was becoming more intense. It had to be becoming clearer that slavery had to end. Certainly, with other shifts in the economy, reducing the numbers of workers required, and the expense of keeping and maintaining a large workforce year-round, the practice of slavery, it just could not be sustained indefinitely. Again, it was the British Imperial Act of 1833, the Abolition Act, that ended chattel slavery, bringing about freedom. It is this that was celebrated spontaneously in the early hours of August 1st, 1834, in many locations in Canada. This was watch night, the time to literally see the dawning of a new day. This night was also a time to gather together to watch out for last-ditch attempts by slave owners and their agents to try to forcibly return African peoples to a more hidden and intense slavery if they could. It was this dawning of a new day in freedom that led to the shouting, the praying, the parading, the dancing, the full celebration of being free. The freedom from chattel slavery was the pressing concern and experience of enslaved Africans that needed to be addressed in 1834. But freedom, as recently departed John Lewis reminds us, is not a place, but a process. Freedom in 2020 means many different things that I'm sure we will further discuss today. Issues sparked by the public execution, the modern day lynching of George Floyd that has brought into question for many people, what kind of society do we really want in the future? Is this the kind of society we want for ourselves, for future generations? How do we connect with what we know to be true, with what we have experienced, and from what we have seen or from what we are learning to our idea of what freedom ought to mean for each one of us? Transformation comes about through a process, and the process of our freedom began with our efforts to resist, was furthered by our combined efforts to challenge and change laws and practices as well that resulted in our freedom. The process of freedom continues. Thank you for your time.